3 weeks later, Elena stood in the medical bay of the orbital station Prometheus, watching Kane work through his physical therapy exercises. The plasma burns on his shoulder and leg were healing well, though the doctors said he would carry the scars for the rest of his life. More importantly, the nerve damage that had temporarily paralyzed his legs was proving to be reversible with treatment. Kane grimaced as he attempted to lift a 10-pound weight with his injured arm. The once mighty sergeant who could handle a 50-pound plasma cannon with ease was now struggling with basic rehabilitation exercises. "Don't push too hard," Elena advised from the doorway. "The doctor said you need to rebuild your strength gradually." Kane looked up at her with an expression that was still unfamiliar, genuine respect mixed with what might have been embarrassment. "Easy for you to say. You carried me 5 miles and didn't even need physical therapy afterward." Elena entered the medical bay and sat down in the chair beside Kane's exercise bench. Her own recovery had been remarkably quick. A few days of rest had been enough to restore her strength, though she still felt twinges in her back when she lifted heavy objects. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Really feeling, not the official medical report version." Kane set down the weight and leaned back against the bench. "Confused mostly. I spent my entire career believing certain things about strength and combat effectiveness. Then you came along and proved me wrong in the most dramatic way possible." Elena studied his face, looking for any trace of his old arrogance or dismissive attitude. She found none. The experience on Kepler 442b had fundamentally changed Kane in ways that went beyond physical healing. "You weren't entirely wrong," Elena said carefully. "Physical strength does matter in combat, but it's not the only thing that matters, and it's not always the most important thing." Kane nodded slowly. "I've had a lot of time to think about that while lying in this bed. I realized that I was so focused on raw muscle power that I ignored everything else. Endurance, technique, determination, intelligence. All the things that actually won us that mission." Through the medical bay's viewport, Elena could see the planet Kepler 442b rotating slowly below them. The mining complex had been retaken by human forces shortly after their extraction, though intelligence suggested the Zephyrians had successfully completed whatever project they had been working on in the central building. "Morrison told me you've been recommended for a medal," Kane said. Elena shrugged. "So have you. And Torres and Morrison. We all did our jobs." "No," Kane replied firmly. "I nearly got us all killed with my stubborn refusal to listen to tactical advice. You saved the mission and my life. There's a difference." The medical bay's doors slid open and Dr. Saracen entered carrying a tablet full of test results. She was a small woman with graying hair and the efficient manner of someone who had spent decades treating combat injuries. "How are we feeling today, Sergeant?" she asked Kane while checking his vital signs. "Like I got hit by a plasma cannon," Kane replied. "But better than yesterday." Dr. Chen made notes on her tablet. "The nerve regeneration is proceeding faster than we expected. You should be cleared for light duty within another week, full duty within a month." Kane looked at Elena. "What about you? Any word on your next assignment?" Elena hesitated. She had received new orders that morning, but she wasn't sure how Kane would react to them. "I've been assigned to a new unit. Advanced Reconnaissance and Rescue Operations. Apparently, Command was impressed with my performance on Kepler 442b. Kane's face broke into what Elena realized was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. "That's outstanding. You deserve it." Dr. Chen finished her examination and headed for the door. "I'll be back to check on you this evening, Sergeant. Try not to overdo the exercises." After the doctor left, Kane and Elena sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Through the viewport, they could see the lights of human ships moving between the orbital platforms like mechanical fireflies. "Can I ask you something?" Kane said eventually. "Sure. When you were carrying me across that battlefield, what kept you going? I weighed twice what you do. You were under fire, and you had to know the odds of making it were terrible." Elena considered the question carefully. "I think it was the same thing that keeps any soldier going in an impossible situation. You do it because it needs to be done and because the person next to you depends on you. It's not about being strong enough, it's about refusing to quit." Kane nodded thoughtfully. "I spent so many years thinking that being a good soldier meant being the biggest, strongest person in the room. But you showed me that real strength is about carrying on when everything logical says you should give up." Elena felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with pride or vindication. This wasn't about proving Kane wrong anymore. It was about helping him understand that strength came in many forms. The funny thing is, Elena said, you were partially right about physical limitations. I couldn't have carried you that distance without the emergency stimulants, the power assist in my armor, and a lot of luck. But what you missed was that recognizing your limitations isn't the same as accepting defeat. Kane attempted the weight exercise again, this time managing 3 repetitions before his muscles gave out. I've been thinking about what I'm going to do differently when I get back to active duty. Starting with apologizing to every female soldier I've ever dismissed or undermined. Elena smiled. That's going to be a long list. Tell me about it. Kane set down the weight and leaned back. I've also been thinking about requesting a transfer to your new unit if they'll have me. Assuming you don't mind working with a reformed chauvinist who owes you his life. Elena was surprised by the request, but pleased. The Kane who sat before her was a very different person from the arrogant sergeant she had met on the transport ship. The experience on Kepler 442b had stripped away his prejudices and forced him to confront the reality of what strength actually meant. I think that could work, Elena said, but you'll have to pass the same qualification tests as everyone else. No special treatment, Kane grinned. I wouldn't have it any other way. Outside the viewport, the stars wheeled slowly in their eternal dance, indifferent to human struggles and victories. But inside the medical bay, 2 soldiers who had learned important lessons about strength, courage, and the value of keeping an open mind began planning for their next mission together. Elena stood up to leave, but Kane called her name one final time. Elena, he said, using her first name naturally now. Thank you. For saving my life, yes, but also for teaching me that being wrong isn't the end of the world. It's the beginning of becoming better. Elena nodded and headed for the door. See you tomorrow, Sergeant. Don't overdo the exercises. As she walked down the corridor toward her quarters, Elena reflected on how much had changed in just 3 weeks. She had proven herself in the most definitive way possible, but more importantly, she had helped change someone's mind about what it meant to be strong. The next time someone questioned whether women belonged in combat, Elena would have a story to tell. And somewhere in the medical bay behind her, Kane would have her back when she told it. The sound of aircraft that Elena had thought meant salvation suddenly changed pitch, becoming a high-pitched whine that she recognized with growing horror. Those weren't human extraction ships, they were Zephyrian air support units, and they were coming in fast. Incoming, Morrison shouted, pulling Elena and Kane deeper into the maze of mining equipment as the first energy salvos began raining down from above. The mining complex had deployed its reserve forces, including atmospheric fighters that Elena's team hadn't known existed. The sleek insectoid craft swooped over their position like predatory birds, their weapon systems lighting up the landscape with deadly precision. Torres grabbed his anti-aircraft launcher, but the weapon had been damaged during the firefight. Sparks flew from its targeting system as he tried to bring it online. Guidance systems fried. I can fire blind, but the chances of hitting anything are minimal. Elena forced herself to sit up despite her exhaustion. Kane was unconscious again, his breathing shallow and irregular. Blood was seeping through the emergency bandages Torres had applied, and his skin had taken on an alarming grayish color. He needs medical attention now, she said. Not in an hour, not in 30 minutes, now. Morrison was frantically trying to raise their actual extraction team on the radio, but the Zephyrian jamming had intensified. Static filled the airwaves, broken only by fragments of garbled transmissions that might have been human voices or might have been electronic interference. An energy bolt from one of the aircraft struck the mining equipment directly above their heads, sending a shower of molten metal cascading down around them. Elena threw herself over Kane's unconscious form, protecting him from the debris with her own body. We can't stay here, Torres said, stating the obvious. They're going to keep hammering this position until there's nothing left. Elena looked around their improvised shelter. The mining equipment provided good protection from ground-based weapons, but it was completely exposed to air attack. The Zephyrian fighters could circle overhead indefinitely, picking them apart piece by piece. Where's the nearest defensible position? She asked Morrison. Morrison consulted his tactical display. There's a maintenance bunker about 200 meters north. Pre-war construction, built to withstand mining explosions. It should be able to handle energy weapons. Elena stared at him in disbelief. 200 meters. In the open? With air support hunting us? I know how it sounds, Morrison replied. But staying here is guaranteed death. At least if we move, we have a chance. Elena looked down at Kane. Moving him another 200 meters would probably kill him, but staying put definitely would. There was no good choice, only degrees of terrible options. Kane's eyes fluttered open as another energy blast shook their shelter. What's happening? We need to move again, Elena told him gently. I'm going to carry you to a bunker. Kane tried to shake his head. Can't, too far. Too heavy. His voice was getting weaker with each word. Elena checked her equipment. Her armor's power systems were completely dead. Her rifle had one magazine left, and her medical supplies were nearly exhausted. By any reasonable measure, attempting another rescue carry was suicide. Torres, she said, can you modify your launcher to fire manually? No guidance system, just point and shoot? Torres examined the weapon. Maybe. But without the targeting computer, I'd need to be really close to have any chance of hitting those fighters. Elena nodded. Then that's what we'll do. Morrison, you and Torres provide covering fire and try to take down at least one of those aircraft. I'll get Kane to the bunker. Morrison grabbed her arm. Elena, you barely made it 50 meters last time. 200 meters with air support shooting at you is impossible. Impossible is what we specialize in, Elena replied, echoing the unofficial motto of their unit. Besides, what choice do we have? She began preparations for what might be her final rescue attempt. Kane's unconscious weight would be even more difficult to manage than before, and the aircraft above would have clear sight lines for most of the journey. Her chances of survival were minimal at best. Kane stirred again as she positioned herself to lift him. Elena, don't do this. Save yourself. We've had this conversation already, Sergeant, Elena replied. I'm not leaving you behind. Kane's eyes focused on her with what might have been his last moment of clarity. I spent months telling you that women weren't strong enough for combat. I was wrong. You're stronger than I ever was. Elena felt tears threatening but pushed them back. There would be time for emotion later if there was a later. Right now, she needed to focus on the mechanics of survival. She activated her comm system one final time. This is Vasquez. If our extraction team is listening, we're moving to the maintenance bunker 2 clicks north of the mining complex. If you can't reach us there, don't risk any more lives trying. Morrison and Torres took positions at the edge of their cover, weapons ready. Elena took a deep breath and lifted Kane's unconscious form, her muscles screaming in protest at the familiar weight. Go, Morrison shouted. Elena burst from cover and immediately came under fire from 2 different aircraft. Energy bolts struck the ground around her feet, turning dirt and rock into superheated plasma. The heat was so intense that her armor's cooling systems failed within the first 10 meters. Torres managed to get one shot off with his damaged launcher. The projectile went wide, but it came close enough to force one of the aircraft to break off its attack run and take evasive maneuvers. Elena ran with Kane's dead weight bouncing against her shoulder, each step sending shock waves of pain through her overtaxed muscles. The distance to the bunker seemed impossible, stretching out before her like an endless desert. One of the aircraft completed its turn and lined up for another strafing run. Elena could see the pilot's compound eyes glinting in the cockpit as it bore down on her position. Time seemed to slow as the aircraft's weapons began to charge for a killing shot. Torres's second projectile caught the fighter directly in its engine intake. The aircraft exploded in a brilliant fireball, sending burning debris raining down across the landscape. The remaining fighter immediately pulled up and began circling at a higher altitude, apparently unwilling to risk the same fate. Elena used the respite to cover another 50 meters, but her strength was finally reaching its absolute limit. Kane's weight felt like it had tripled, and her legs were beginning to buckle with each step. She could taste blood in her mouth and feel her vision starting to tunnel from oxygen deprivation. The bunker was still over 100 meters away when Elena's body finally began to shut down. Her legs gave out completely, sending both her and Kane tumbling to the ground in a heap. She tried to get back up, but her muscles simply refused to respond. Can't, she gasped into her comm system. Can't make it. The remaining aircraft began its final attack run, diving toward Elena's helpless position with weapons charging. She closed her eyes and waited for the end, knowing she had done everything humanly possible. The energy blast never came. Instead, Elena heard the distinctive roar of human plasma cannons and looked up to see their extraction team's gunships engaging the Zephyrian fighter. The enemy aircraft exploded in seconds under the Concentrated firepower of multiple human warships, medical personnel were already rappelling down from the hovering aircraft as Elena finally allowed herself to collapse completely. She had carried Kane nearly 300 meters under impossible conditions, proving once and for all that strength wasn't just about muscle mass, it was about the refusal to give up when everything looked hopeless. 20 meters from safety, Elena's luck ran out. The Zephyrians had finally coordinated their fire patterns, and energy bolts began impacting in a deadly constellation around her position. The ground beneath her feet turned to molten slag, forcing her to change direction and adding precious seconds to an already desperate journey. Kane's weight seemed to increase with every step. Her armor's power assist was beginning to fail under the sustained load, and warning indicators flashed red across her heads-up display. Worse, she could feel Kane's breathing becoming more irregular against her shoulder. The blood loss was getting worse despite the emergency treatment she had given him. "Talk to me, Kane," she said, trying to keep him conscious. "Stay with me." Kane's response was barely audible. "Can't feel my legs anymore." Elena's heart sank. The loss of sensation could mean nerve damage from the plasma burns, or it could indicate that Kane was slipping deeper into shock. Either way, it meant she was now carrying dead weight with no assistance from him whatsoever. Morrison's voice crackled through her comm system, distorted by interference. "Vasquez, we've got a problem. Zephyrian reinforcements are moving to cut off your route. You need to adjust course to the north." Elena glanced left toward the suggested route. It would add another 15 meters to her journey, and the terrain was rougher, scattered with loose rocks and twisted metal debris that would make carrying Kane even more difficult. "Negative," she replied. "I can't make it that far." "You have to," Torres interjected. "They're setting up a crossfire pattern on your current path. You'll be walking into a kill zone." Elena looked ahead at the direct route to safety. She could see what Torres meant. Zephyrian soldiers were moving into position to create overlapping fields of fire that would make survival impossible. But the alternative route might be equally deadly if her strength gave out before she reached cover. An energy bolt passed so close to her head that it singed her hair despite her helmet's protection. The shot had come from a new angle, confirming that the Zephyrians were indeed repositioning for a coordinated attack. Elena made her decision. She veered north, heading for the rougher terrain that offered the only chance of avoiding the crossfire. The first step onto uneven ground nearly sent them both tumbling, as her foot found a hidden depression in the rocky surface. Kane groaned as the movement jarred his injuries. "Leave me," he whispered. "Get yourself out." "Not happening, Sergeant," Elena replied, adjusting her grip to better distribute his weight. "I didn't come this far to quit now." The northern route was a nightmare of obstacles. Every few steps, Elena had to navigate around twisted metal beams or chunks of shattered concrete. Kane's boots kept catching on debris, threatening to trip them both. Twice she had to stop completely to untangle his equipment from jagged edges. Her breathing was becoming ragged, and she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. The power assist in her armor finally gave out completely, leaving her to support Kane's full weight with just her own muscles. The emergency medical supplies in her pack felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. "Contact left," Morrison shouted over the comm. Elena saw muzzle flashes from the ruins of a destroyed building. A squad of Zephyrians had anticipated her route change and moved to intercept. Energy weapons began firing from multiple positions, forcing Elena to take cover behind an overturned mining vehicle. The shelter was temporary at best. Energy bolts were already eating through the vehicle's armor plating, and Elena could see Zephyrian soldiers moving to flank their position. She had maybe 30 seconds before they would be completely exposed again. Kane's eyes fluttered open. "How many?" Elena peered around the edge of their cover. 6, maybe 7. "They've got us pinned down." Kane tried to reach for his sidearm with his good hand, but the movement caused him to cry out in pain. Give me your rifle." "I can still shoot," Elena hesitated. Her rifle was their only real defense, but Kane was a better marksman than she was when he wasn't injured. On the other hand, he could barely hold his head up, let alone aim accurately. "Keep it," Kane said, seeing her hesitation. "I'm more liability than help right now." Elena checked her ammunition counter. Half a magazine left, plus 2 spare clips. Not much for a sustained firefight, but it would have to do. She needed to clear a path to the final stretch of their journey. She activated her rifle's targeting system and selected the nearest Zephyrian position. The alien soldier was partially concealed behind rubble, but enough of his torso was visible for a clean shot. Elena controlled her breathing, waited for a gap in the enemy fire, and squeezed the trigger. The kinetic round punched through the Zephyrian's natural armor, sending him spinning backward into the ruins. His companions immediately adjusted their positions, but Elena was already targeting the next threat. 2 more shots, 2 more hits. The remaining Zephyrians took cover, giving Elena the opening she needed. "Can you hold on for another sprint?" she asked Kane. Kane nodded weakly. "Do it." Elena hefted Kane's weight again and broke from cover. Without the power assist, every step was agony. Her legs felt like they were on fire, and her back screamed in protest at the awkward angle required to carry Kane effectively. The remaining Zephyrians emerged from cover, firing at the moving targets. Elena ran in a serpentine pattern, using every evasion technique she had ever learned. Energy bolts sizzled past them, close enough that she could feel the heat through her armor. Kane's weight shifted suddenly as his injured leg caught on a piece of debris. The unexpected movement sent Elena stumbling forward, and for a terrifying moment, she thought they were both going down. She managed to recover her balance at the last second, but the near fall cost precious time and energy. 10 meters, Morrison called out. "You're almost there." Elena could see their destination now, the cluster of mining equipment where Morrison and Torres were providing covering fire. It looked impossibly far away, but she forced herself to keep moving. Her vision was starting to tunnel from exhaustion, and she could taste blood in her mouth from the exertion. Kane's breathing was becoming shallow and rapid. "Elena," he said, using her first name for the first time since they had met. "If we don't make it, I'm sorry about everything I said." "We're going to make it," Elena replied firmly, "and you can apologize properly when we're both safe." She summoned reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, driven by determination that went beyond mere survival. Kane had spent months undermining her, questioning her capabilities and treating her like a burden. Now she was literally carrying him to safety, proving that strength came in many forms. The final 5 meters were the longest of Elena's life. Her legs moved on pure willpower, her muscles having long since passed their breaking point. Kane's weight felt like it had doubled, and her armor's environmental systems were failing to keep up with her elevated body temperature. But she kept moving forward, one impossible step at a time, until finally, she stumbled into the shelter of the mining equipment and collapsed with Kane beside her. Morrison and Torres immediately moved to help, dragging both of them deeper into cover as energy bolts continued to impact their position. "Medical kit," Elena gasped, pointing toward Kane. "He's going into shock." Torres began working on Kane's injuries while Morrison established radio contact with their extraction team. Elena lay on her back, staring up at the alien sky, her entire body shaking from exhaustion. Kane looked over at her, his eyes clearer than they had been during the entire rescue. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About everything," Elena managed a weak smile. "I know, but we can discuss that after we get you to a medical facility." The sound of approaching aircraft filled the air. Their extraction team, finally able to reach them now that they were clear of the Zephyrian crossfire. Elena closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had carried a man twice her size through 5 miles of hostile territory under enemy fire. Kane would never question her strength again. Elena crouched beside Kane, her mind racing through tactical options. The Zephyrian fire had temporarily lessened thanks to Morrison and Torres's covering fire, but she knew it wouldn't last long. The enemy was already adjusting their positions to get better angles on their location. Kane's breathing was labored, and his face had taken on a grayish pallor that Elena recognized as the early stages of shock. The energy blast had done more damage than she initially thought, not just to his shoulder but to his entire left side. His leg wasn't just twisted. There appeared to be burns along his thigh where the energy had cascaded down his body. "How bad is it?" Kane asked, trying to project his usual confidence but failing to hide the pain in his voice. Elena pulled out her medical scanner and ran it over his injuries. The readout confirmed her fears. Severe plasma burns, possible internal bleeding, and definitely a fractured leg. Without immediate medical attention, Kane would go into full shock within the hour. "Bad enough," she said honestly. "You need a medical facility, not a battlefield patch job." Kane attempted a grim smile. Well, that's just perfect. Looks like your sergeant is going to die because he was too stupid to listen to the smart person on the team. Elena glanced up sharply. It was the first time Kane had ever admitted she might know what she was talking about. You're not going to die, Sergeant. Not on my watch. Energy bolts began impacting closer to their position as the Zephyrians found new firing angles. Elena could hear Morrison coordinating with Torres over the comm system, but they were running low on ammunition and couldn't maintain suppressing fire indefinitely. Vasquez. Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. We've got movement on the south wall. Looks like they're trying to flank us. You need to get out of there now. Elena looked at Kane, then at the 50 meters of open ground between their position and relative safety. Under normal circumstances, she could cover that distance in less than 10 seconds. But carrying a 200-pound injured man while under fire was a completely different proposition. Can you put any weight on your good leg? She asked Kane. He tried to stand and immediately collapsed back down. Not happening. Everything from the waist down feels like it's on fire. Elena made a quick calculation. Kane outweighed her by nearly 80 pounds, and his armor added another 40 pounds to that total. In training exercises, she had managed to carry wounded soldiers over short distances, but never anything close to this distance under combat conditions. Listen carefully, she told Kane, pulling out an emergency stimulant injector. I'm going to give you a pain blocker and a muscle relaxant. It's going to make you feel strange, but it'll help me move you without causing more damage. Kane's eyes widened slightly. Move me. Vasquez, you can't carry me 50 meters. I'm twice your size. I can and I will, Elena replied firmly, injecting the medication into Kane's neck. But I need you to help me as much as you can. When I lift you, try to keep your injured leg off the ground and don't fight my movements. The medication took effect quickly, and Kane's pain-tightened features began to relax slightly. Elena positioned herself beside him, working her arms under his good shoulder and around his waist. She had studied emergency carry techniques extensively, but the reality of lifting Kane's massive frame was more challenging than any textbook had prepared her for. This is insane, Kane mumbled as the drugs began affecting his speech. You're going to get us both killed. Elena activated her comm system. Morrison, I need continuous covering fire on the guard towers. Don't worry about conserving ammunition, just keep their heads down. Roger that. We'll give you everything we've got. Elena took a deep breath and engaged the power assist systems in her armor. The lightweight exoskeleton wasn't designed for heavy lifting, but it could provide some additional support for her muscles. She positioned Kane's good arm around her shoulders and prepared to lift. On 3, she told him. 1, 2, 3. Elena stood up, bringing Kane with her. The weight was incredible, like trying to lift a fallen tree while someone shot at her. Her knees nearly buckled under the sudden load, but the power assist kicked in just in time to stabilize her stance. Kane groaned as his injured leg dragged against the ground. Put me down. This isn't going to work. It's going to work because it has to work, Elena said through gritted teeth. She adjusted her grip, trying to distribute Kane's weight more evenly across her frame. Her armor's heads-up display immediately began flashing warnings about exceeded load limits and potential system failures. The first step was the hardest. Elena's legs felt like they were made of lead, and Kane's weight threatened to topple them both forward. But she managed to keep her balance and take another step, then another. Energy bolts began impacting around them as the Zephyrians realized what was happening. Elena could hear Morrison and Torres firing frantically, trying to keep the enemy suppressed, but return fire was getting heavier by the second. Vasquez, move faster, Torres shouted over the comm. They're bringing up reinforcements. Elena wanted to move faster, but physics had other ideas. Each step required careful planning and execution. She had to maintain Kane's position while watching for incoming fire, while navigating the uneven terrain covered with mining debris. Kane's head lolled against her shoulder, the medication making him groggy. Should have listened to you, he mumbled. About the trap. About everything. Save your strength, Elena replied, her breathing already becoming labored. They had covered maybe 10 meters, and she could feel her muscles beginning to protest the sustained effort. A particularly close energy blast melted a piece of metal just inches from Elena's head, filling the air with toxic fumes. The heat was so intense she could feel it through her armor's environmental systems. She instinctively ducked, nearly losing her balance under Kane's weight. They're zeroing in on us, Morrison warned. Whatever you're going to do, do it fast. Elena forced herself to pick up the pace, ignoring her armor's protests and her own body's limitations. Kane had been wrong about many things, but he had been right about one. Carrying a wounded soldier under fire was one of the most physically demanding things a person could do. But what Kane had failed to understand was that physical strength wasn't just about muscle mass. It was about determination, training, and the refusal to quit when everything looked impossible. Elena had all three in abundance. Another energy bolt struck the ground near her feet, and Elena realized the Zephyrians were getting better at predicting her movement pattern. She needed to change tactics, but with Kane's dead weight hampering her mobility, options were limited. How much farther? Kane asked weakly. Elena glanced toward their destination. Morrison and Torres were still laying down covering fire from behind the mining equipment, but the distance looked impossibly far. 30 meters, she lied. It was closer to 40, but Kane didn't need to know that. Her legs were beginning to shake from the sustained effort, and sweat was pooling inside her armor despite the cooling systems running at maximum. Every step felt like it might be her last, but Elena kept moving forward, one painful meter at a time. She was beginning to understand why soldiers talked about heroism in terms of small moments, rather than grand gestures. Real courage wasn't about charging into battle with guns blazing. It was about taking the next step when your body screamed for you to stop, about continuing forward when every logical part of your mind said the situation was hopeless. Kane had spent months telling her she wasn't strong enough for real combat. Now she was proving him wrong in the most literal way possible, carrying him to safety while enemy fire rained down around them. But the irony was lost on Elena. She was too focused on the simple mechanics of putting one foot in front of the other to think about vindication. The team reached the outer perimeter of the mining complex without detection, taking cover behind a cluster of abandoned mining equipment. Elena could smell the acrid scent of Zephyrian technology growing stronger as they approached the energy barriers. The defensive fields hummed with barely contained power, casting an eerie blue glow over the surrounding area. Morrison studied the barrier through his scope. Looks like a standard Mark 7 field generator. Should be vulnerable to concentrated plasma fire. Kane hefted his cannon eagerly. Just point me at it, LT. I'll punch a hole big enough to drive a transport through. Elena frowned as she watched the Zephyrian patrols. Something felt wrong about their movement patterns. Lieutenant, they're not patrolling randomly anymore. Look at how they're positioning themselves. Morrison followed her gaze. The insectoid soldiers had shifted their routes, creating overlapping fields of observation that covered every approach to the barrier generator. You're right. It's like they know we're here. Impossible, Kane scoffed. We've been silent the whole way. These bugs aren't smart enough to anticipate human tactics. Elena's unease deepened. She had studied Zephyrian behavior extensively, and what she was seeing didn't match their normal defensive patterns. Sergeant, I think you're underestimating them. They've been fighting humans for 3 years. They've learned to adapt. They've learned to dig holes and hide, Kane replied dismissively. That's not the same as being tactically sophisticated. Torres pointed toward the main building. LT, I'm seeing a lot of movement around the central structure. Way more than intel suggested. Morrison raised his binoculars again. Through the enhanced optics, he could see dozens of Zephyrians moving in and out of the building in organized formations. Some carried equipment he didn't recognize, while others seemed to be transporting something heavy between the structure and the mining shafts. Whatever they're doing in there, it's big, he murmured. Command needs to know about this. Elena activated her communications array, trying to establish contact with the orbital support ships. Static filled her earpiece, punctuated by bursts of interference that made communication impossible. I'm not getting through. Something's jamming our signals. Kane checked his plasma cannon's charge indicator. Then we do this the old-fashioned way. We go in shooting and figure out what they're up to after we kill them all. Morrison hesitated. Their orders were to secure the facility and hold it until reinforcements arrived. But the situation on the ground was clearly different from what Command had expected. The smart move would be to pull back and request additional support. I don't like this, Elena said. The jamming, the increased security, the organized movement, it feels like a trap. Everything feels like a trap when you're scared, Kane shot back. But sometimes you just have to trust your training and do the job. Before Morrison could respond, Kane was already moving toward the barrier generator. His heavy armor made stealth impossible, but he seemed determined to prove his point about direct action being superior to careful planning. "Kane, get back here," Morrison hissed into his comm, but the sergeant was already committed to his assault. Kane reached the optimal firing position and raised his plasma cannon. The weapon's charging cycle created a high-pitched whine that cut through the air like a knife. Zephyrian heads turned in his direction, compound eyes reflecting the weapon's energy signature. "Contact," Kane shouted as he pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt struck the barrier generator dead center, sending cascades of blue energy crackling across the defensive field. For a moment, the barrier flickered and weakened, but instead of collapsing entirely, backup generators kicked in, reinforcing the damaged section within seconds. Immediately, the complex erupted in activity. Alarms shrieked across the facility, and Zephyrian soldiers poured out of hidden positions that hadn't shown up on any reconnaissance reports. Energy weapons began firing from every direction, filling the air with deadly bolts of crackling power. "Fall back," Morrison ordered, but it was too late for a tactical withdrawal. Kane found himself caught in the open, taking fire from 3 different guard towers simultaneously. His heavy armor deflected most of the energy blasts, but the sheer volume of incoming fire was overwhelming even his enhanced protection systems. Elena watched in horror as Kane stumbled under the barrage. A particularly powerful bolt struck his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a pile of mining debris. His plasma cannon skittered away across the rocky ground, leaving him defenseless. "Kane's down," Torres shouted, laying down suppressing fire with his assault rifle. Morrison was already calculating angles and distances. "We need to get him out of there, but those towers have the whole area covered." Elena could see Kane struggling to get back on his feet, his left arm hanging useless at his side. Blood was seeping through a crack in his armor where the energy blast had found a weak point. He was trying to reach his sidearm, but his injured arm wasn't responding to commands. The Zephyrians seemed to recognize that they had wounded a human, and their fire intensified. Energy bolts struck the ground around Kane, sending up sprays of molten rock and metal. He was completely pinned down with no cover and no way to fight back effectively. "I can get to him," Elena said, studying the pattern of enemy fire. Morrison shook his head. "Negative. Those energy weapons will cut right through your light armor. We need to find another way." "There is no other way," Elena insisted. "Look at the firing angles. They've got him completely surrounded. If we don't move now, he's dead." Torres continued firing at the nearest guard tower, but his rifle couldn't penetrate the Zephyrian fortifications. "She's right, LT. Nobody else can reach him in time." Elena was already checking her equipment. Her medical kit contained emergency stimulants and battlefield surgery supplies. Her lighter armor would allow her to move faster than anyone else on the team, but it also meant she would have minimal protection against enemy fire. Kane's voice crackled through the comm system, weak but defiant. Don't risk it. I knew this was a bad idea from the start." Elena felt a surge of anger at his continued stubbornness, even while bleeding and trapped. "Shut up, Kane. Save your strength for staying alive." Vasquez, Morrison grabbed her arm as she prepared to move. "If you go out there, you might not come back." Elena looked at Kane, pinned down and helpless despite all his talk about strength and superiority. "If I don't go, he definitely won't come back." She took a deep breath and checked her rifle one final time. The distance to Kane's position was roughly 50 meters across open ground, covered by at least 6 different firing positions. The Zephyrians had excellent aim and their energy weapons moved at the speed of light. But Elena had advantages that Kane's brute force approach lacked. She was smaller, faster, and trained in evasive movement techniques. More importantly, she had studied Zephyrian firing patterns extensively and knew their weapons had brief recharge cycles between shots. "Give me covering fire on my signal," she told Morrison and Torres. "Concentrate on the nearest guard tower. I'll move during their reload cycle." Morrison wanted to argue, but he could see the determination in Elena's eyes. "Roger that. On your mark." Elena sprinted from cover just as the guard tower finished a firing sequence. She ran in a zigzag pattern, using her knowledge of Zephyrian timing to stay ahead of their targeting systems. Energy bolts sizzled past her head and shoulders, but none found their mark. She reached Kane's position just as her own team's covering fire forced the nearest enemies to take cover. Kane looked up at her with surprise and something that might have been respect. "Told you this was a bad idea," he mumbled, but his voice lacked its usual arrogance. Elena quickly assessed his injuries. The energy blast had penetrated his armor and caused significant damage to his shoulder and upper arm. He was losing blood steadily, and his face was pale with shock. "Can you walk?" she asked, pulling medical supplies from her pack. Kane tried to stand and immediately collapsed back against the debris. "Something's wrong with my leg, too. Must have twisted it when I fell." Elena looked around at their situation. They were still completely surrounded. Kane couldn't walk, and her light armor meant she couldn't carry him and fight effectively at the same time. But she had made it this far, and she wasn't about to give up now. The transport touched down in a clearing 2 kilometers from the mining complex, its engines kicking up clouds of red dust. Elena felt the familiar jolt as the landing struts made contact with solid ground. Through the porthole, she could see the twisted remains of what had once been a forest, now reduced to blackened stumps and scorched earth. "Move, move, move," Morrison shouted as the rear ramp dropped. The team sprinted out of the transport, weapons ready, scanning for threats. The air tasted of smoke and ozone, with an underlying metallic scent that Elena had learned to associate with Zephyrian technology. Kane was the first to reach the tree line, his heavy armor clanking with each step. Despite his size, he moved with surprising grace, his plasma cannon sweeping left and right as he searched for targets. Elena followed close behind, her lighter armor allowing her to move more quietly through the debris. The mining complex loomed ahead of them, its defensive walls scarred by weeks of fighting. Energy barriers flickered blue and white around the perimeter, designed to stop human projectiles while allowing Zephyrian weapons to pass through unimpeded. Guard towers sprouted from the walls like mechanical flowers, their sensor arrays constantly rotating as they searched for incoming threats. Morrison held up his fist, and the team dropped to cover behind a fallen log. He pulled out his binoculars and studied the complex. "Looks like they've reinforced since the last intel report. I count 6 guard towers instead of 4, and they've added another barrier generator on the north wall." Torres wiped sweat from his forehead. Despite the red giant sun hanging low in the sky, the temperature was barely above freezing. "How do we get through those barriers, LT?" "Same way we always do," Kane said, patting his plasma cannon. "Blow a hole in them and walk through." Elena studied the complex through her rifle's scope. The magnification revealed details that naked eyes couldn't see. Zephyrian soldiers moved along the walls in organized patrols, their insectoid bodies covered in natural chitin armor that gleamed like black metal. They carried energy weapons that looked like organic growths rather than manufactured tools. "I count at least 60 hostiles," she reported, "maybe more inside the buildings. They're not just defending, they're preparing for something." Kane glanced at her dismissively. "Since when do you know how to read enemy formations?" "Since I spent 3 years studying Zephyrian tactics at the War College," Elena replied evenly. "Look at the patrol patterns. They're not random. They're protecting something specific in the central building." Morrison lowered his binoculars. "What kind of something?" Elena adjusted her scope's magnification. "Hard to tell from here, but there's a lot of activity around the main entrance. Could be a command center, or maybe they're excavating something from the mines." Kane snorted. "Or maybe they're just scared and clustering together like bugs do when you step on their nest. Either way, it doesn't change our mission. We go in, we kill bugs, we secure the facility." "It's not that simple," Elena protested. "If they're protecting something important, they'll fight harder. We need to approach this tactically, not just charge and shooting." "Listen, Princess." Kane's voice carried the edge of long-suppressed irritation. "I was fighting bugs when you were still playing with dolls. You don't need tactics to deal with these things. You just need enough firepower and the backbone to use it." Morrison tried to mediate. "Both approaches have merit. Kane, you'll take point with your heavy weapon. Vasquez, you'll provide overwatch and communications. Torres, you're with me in the center." Kane shook his head. "LT, with respect, I think you're making a mistake. When we hit that compound, things are going to get messy fast. Vasquez should stay back with the transport and coordinate with command. Let the real fighters handle the groundwork." Elena felt her jaw clench but kept her voice level. "I'm not staying behind, Sergeant. I have my orders and I'm going to follow them." "Your orders?" Kane's voice rose slightly. "Your orders are to support the mission, not get in the way of it. When plasma starts flying and bugs are charging our position, the last thing I need to worry about is babysitting someone who can't pull her own weight." Torres looked uncomfortable. "Maybe we should focus on the mission brief," Kane continued as if he hadn't heard. Look, Vasquez, I'm sure you're real brave and all that, but bravery doesn't make up for the fact that you weigh half what I do and carry half the firepower. When push comes to shove, you're going to be a liability. Elena stood up from her crouch, facing Kane directly. I've completed every mission I've been assigned to, Sergeant. My record speaks for itself. Your record is a bunch of easy assignments where the real soldiers did the heavy lifting while you provided support. Kane made air quotes with his massive hands. This is different. This is a stand-up fight against an entrenched enemy. You think those bugs care about your feelings or your equality theories? They'll tear you apart without breaking stride. Morrison stepped between them. That's enough, both of you. We have a mission to complete, and we're going to complete it as a team. Kane, Vasquez is a qualified soldier and she's coming with us. Vasquez, stay focused on the objective. Kane shouldered his plasma cannon with obvious frustration. Fine, but don't come crying to me when things go sideways and you realize you're in over your head. Elena checked her rifle one final time, making sure the safety was off and the ammunition counter showed full capacity. I won't need to come crying to anyone, Sergeant. I can handle whatever we face in there. The team moved out in tactical formation, using the scattered debris for cover as they approached the complex. Elena found herself wondering if Kane's attitude was based on genuine concern or just old-fashioned prejudice. She had encountered both during her military career, and sometimes it was difficult to tell the difference. The Zephyrians had chosen their defensive position well. The mining complex sat on elevated ground with clear sight lines in all directions. The defensive walls were built from local stone reinforced with their biometal technology, creating barriers that could withstand human weapons while remaining permeable to their own energy attacks. As they got closer, Elena could hear the distinctive chittering sound that Zephyrians made when communicating. It reminded her of insects, which wasn't far from the truth. The enemy had evolved on a world where survival depended on perfect coordination within the hive structure. Hold position, Morrison whispered into his comm unit. I'm seeing movement on the north wall. Elena raised her rifle and peered through the scope. A patrol of 4 Zephyrians was making its way along the wall's top, their compound eyes scanning the approaches for threats. Their natural armor gleamed in the alien sunlight, and she could see the organic weapon pods grafted to their forearms. Kane was already lining up his shot. Give me the word, LT, and I'll take out the whole patrol. Negative, Morrison replied. We need to get closer before we engage. If we alert them now, they'll lock down the entire complex. Elena studied the patrol's movement pattern. They're following a predictable route. If we time it right, we can slip past them during their blind spot. Kane rolled his eyes. Or we could just kill them and move on. Dead bugs don't raise alarms. Dead bugs get replaced by live bugs who know we're here, Elena countered. Stealth gives us the advantage of surprise. Morrison considered both options. Vasquez is right. We go quiet until we reach the main objective. Save the fireworks for when we actually need them. Kane muttered something under his breath that Elena didn't catch, but his tone made his opinion clear. As they began to move forward again, she couldn't shake the feeling that Kane's stubborn refusal to treat her as an equal was going to cause problems for the entire team. The transport ship Meridian shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace above the war-torn planet of Kepler 442b. Captain Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the small porthole, watching the scarred surface of the world below. Massive craters dotted the landscape like pockmarks, evidence of 3 years of brutal fighting between human forces and the insectoid Zephyrians. Look at that mess, muttered Sergeant Marcus Kane from the seat across from her. He was a mountain of a man, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with shoulders that seemed to fill doorways. His weathered face bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, and his gray eyes held the cold confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. Another cleanup mission for the ground pounders. Elena didn't respond immediately. At 5 feet 6 inches, she was average height for a woman, but her lean frame carried the wiry strength of someone who had spent years in combat zones. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her brown eyes missed nothing. She had learned long ago that in a unit dominated by men like Kane, action spoke louder than words. Intel says the Zephyrians have dug in deep around the mining complex, said Lieutenant Jake Morrison, their team leader. He was young for his rank, maybe 25, with the kind of fresh-faced enthusiasm that came from too many successful missions and not enough real adversity. We go in fast, secure the facility, and hold until the main force arrives. Kane snorted. Should be easy enough. Bugs don't like fighting humans up close. They prefer to hide behind their energy barriers and take potshots. He glanced at Elena with barely concealed disdain. Though I still don't understand why Command keeps sending women to do men's work. This isn't a charity mission. The transport fell silent except for the hum of engines. Elena felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She had heard variations of this speech from Kane at least a dozen times in the 6 months since joining the 47th Assault Battalion. According to him, women were too weak, too emotional, and too fragile for real combat. Never mind that she had scored higher than him on every physical test, or that her marksmanship ratings were in the top 5% of the entire battalion. Kane, Morrison warned, but the sergeant waved him off. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. LT, look at her. Kane pointed at Elena like she wasn't sitting 3 feet away. She weighs what, maybe 120 soaking wet? What happens when we need someone to carry a wounded soldier to safety? What happens when we need someone to hold a line against a Zephyrian charge? You gonna trust your life to someone who can barely lift her own pack? Private Torres, a stocky man from Texas, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sarge, maybe we should focus on the mission. This is about the mission, Kane shot back. I've got nothing personal against Vasquez. Hell, I'm sure she's real good at fixing radios or patching wounds. But when the shooting starts, I want to know the person next to me can handle the heavy lifting. Elena finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. I can handle whatever needs handling, Sergeant. Kane laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the cramped transport. Can you now? Tell me, Vasquez, what's the furthest you've ever carried a wounded man under fire? I've never had to, Elena replied honestly, exactly my point. You've never had to because there's always been a real soldier around to do the job. Kane leaned forward, his massive frame intimidating in the small space. War isn't a training exercise, sweetheart. When your buddy takes a plasma round to the chest and there's bugs shooting at you from 3 directions, you don't get to call for backup. You either carry him out or you watch him die. Morrison started to intervene, but Elena held up a hand. And what makes you think I couldn't do that, Sergeant? Basic biology, Kane said with satisfaction. Men are stronger than women. It's not an opinion, it's a fact. My grandmother could deadlift more than you on her worst day. Strength isn't just about muscle mass, Elena countered. It's about endurance, determination, and the will to keep going when everything looks hopeless. Kane rolled his eyes. Pretty words, but they don't stop bullets or carry a 200-pound soldier through 5 miles of hostile territory. The transport's intercom crackled to life. 10 minutes to drop zone. Check your gear and prepare for deployment. The conversation died as the team went through their pre-mission routine. Elena checked her assault rifle, a modified M49 that fired both kinetic rounds and plasma bursts. Her armor was lighter than the standard-issue male variant, designed for mobility rather than maximum protection. She carried extra medical supplies, communications equipment, and enough ammunition for a sustained firefight. Kane, by contrast, wore heavy assault armor that made him look like a walking tank. His weapon was a massive plasma cannon that could punch through Zephyrian chitin armor like paper. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own abilities. As the transport began its descent, Elena felt the familiar mix of excitement and fear that came before every mission. She had joined the military to prove that women could fight alongside men as equals. Every mission was another chance to demonstrate that courage and skill mattered more than physical size. The Zephyrians had invaded human space 3 years ago, claiming that humanity was too weak and primitive to deserve their worlds. They were wrong about humanity's resolve, but their individual warriors were formidable opponents. Standing 8 feet tall with razor-sharp claws and natural armor plating, they had initially overwhelmed human forces through sheer physical superiority. But humans had adapted. They developed better weapons, better tactics, and better armor. Most importantly, they had learned to fight as a team, using their intelligence and determination to overcome the Zephyrians' natural advantages. Elena strapped herself in as the transport shook from atmospheric turbulence. Below them, the mining complex looked like a small city surrounded by defensive walls and guard towers. Smoke rose from several buildings, and she could see the distinctive blue flashes of Zephyrian energy weapons. Looks like the bugs are still putting up a fight, Torres observed. Morrison studied the tactical display on his wrist computer. Intel was right about the defenses. We're looking at least 50 hostiles, maybe more. They've got the main building locked down tight. Kane chambered a round in his plasma cannon. Good. I was starting to worry this would be too easy. Elena said nothing, but her grip tightened on her rifle. She had a feeling that before this mission was over, Kane would get more than he bargained for. The question was whether any of them would live long enough to see who was right about strength and determination.